"You're not my daughter. Not anymore." That's what my father said to me standing in the kitchen doorway of the house I grew up in 3 weeks before my 23rd birthday. My mother was behind him, arms crossed, not looking at me at all, looking at the floor like I was something spilled on it. I'm Evelyn Allen, and that Tuesday afternoon in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is the day my family decided I was disposable. I'd found out I was pregnant 9 days earlier. I wasn't married. In my house, that wasn't a mistake, that was a verdict. My father was a deacon at our church. My mother ran the women's ministry. Our house had a framed needlepoint in the hallway that said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And under that same roof, 20 minutes after I told them, my father called me a disgrace to his name. I stood there in the kitchen holding a plate I'd been drying, and I said, "I'm still me. I'm still your daughter." He said, "My daughter wouldn't do this to this family." My mother finally looked up. She said, "What will people at church say? What will Pastor Whitfield say?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Who's the father?" Just, "What will people say?" I said, "I'm scared. I need you." My father took the plate out of my hands, set it on the counter, and said, "Then you should have thought about that before you shamed us." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did, for a long time after. In the dark, in a car, in rooms that weren't mine, I sat with that sentence. He told me to pack a bag. He told me I had until Sunday, until after church, so the neighbors wouldn't see a moving truck and start asking questions, to be gone. My own father, timing my exit around his reputation. I asked him, "Where am I supposed to go?" He didn't answer. He just walked out of the kitchen. And my mother picked the plate back up, turned to the sink, and started washing it, like nothing had happened, like I wasn't standing right there. That Sunday, I put 4 garbage bags of my life into the back of a 2011 Honda Civic with a check engine light that had been on for 6 months, and I drove away from the only house I'd ever known. 23 years old, 3 months pregnant, with $340 to my name. I didn't cry until I hit the stop sign at the end of the block. Then I sat there and I couldn't stop. What my parents didn't know yet, what nobody in that house knew, is that the daughter they were so ashamed of was about to build something they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting they weren't part of. If you've ever been made to feel like your own family's shame instead of their child, stay with me. This one's going to hurt before it heals. Hit subscribe, because Chapter 2, my mother does something that makes this whole thing so much worse. Phoebe found me an hour after I left my parents' house, parked outside a closed laundromat on Route 30, engine off, hazards on, just sitting there because I didn't know where else to point the car. She didn't ask me to explain. She just pulled up behind me, got out, tapped on my window, and said, "Pop the trunk." Phoebe and I had been friends since 8th grade, back when she used to sneak snacks into my locker because my parents kept our fridge locked to what they called portion discipline. She was the only person outside my house who knew what that house was really like behind the needlepoint on the wall. She loaded my 4 garbage bags into her Corolla without a single question, and she said, "You're staying with me." End of discussion. I told her I couldn't ask that of her. She had a 1-bedroom apartment above a nail salon in Reading, 30 minutes east, and barely enough space for herself. She said, "You didn't ask, I'm telling you." Same stubborn tone she'd had since we were 14. That first night on her pull-out couch, I lay there with my hand on my stomach, still not fully able to believe that 6 hours earlier I'd had a childhood bedroom, and now I didn't. The calls started the next morning. Not from my father, from my mother. She called 4 times before 9 a.m. I finally picked up on the 5th, thinking maybe she'd changed her mind overnight. Maybe she'd tell me to come home. Instead, she said, "Evelyn, I need you to understand something. Your father has already told Pastor Whitfield you're dealing with a private family matter and you're staying with relatives out of state for a while. I need you to not correct that story." I said, "You want me to lie?" She said, "I want you to protect this family." I said, "I am this family." She was quiet for a second, and then she said the thing that I don't think I'll ever fully forgive. She said, "Not anymore, sweetheart. Not until this is handled." Handled. Like I was a leak in the roof. I hung up on her. First time in my life I had ever hung up on my mother. My hands were shaking so hard I put the phone down on Phoebe's kitchen counter like it was something contaminated. Phoebe watched me from the stove where she was making eggs before her shift at the hospital, where she worked as a surgical scheduler. She said, "What'd she say?" I told her. All of it. The handled word, the instruction to lie to our own pastor, the fact that in less than 24 hours, my existence had become a PR problem for people who'd raised me to believe family was supposed to be unconditional. Phoebe set the spatula down. She said, "You know what's funny? Your mom taught the Sunday school lesson on the prodigal son twice a year for as long as I've known her. The whole while he was still a long way off, his father ran to him thing." She shook her head. "Guess that only applies if the shame is quiet enough." That line stuck with me for weeks. Word got around faster than I expected. Lancaster's not a small town, but our church was a small world, and small worlds move fast. By the end of that week, I found out through a cousin's Facebook post, not directly, of course, nobody had the nerve to say it to my face, that my parents were telling people I'd moved to help a sick aunt in Ohio. I don't have a sick aunt in Ohio. I don't have any aunt in Ohio. They didn't just cut me off, they erased me and replaced me with a story that made them look faithful and made me disappear entirely. No shame on them, no questions from the congregation, no explaining an unmarried pregnant daughter to people who'd known me since I was in the church nursery. I found out my old bedroom had already been turned into what my mother was calling the sewing room less than 2 weeks after I left. My cousin sent me a photo without meaning to twist the knife. She just thought it was a nice room. My bed frame was already at the curb. I sat on Phoebe's pull-out couch that night, 7 weeks pregnant, staring at that photo, and something in me went quiet and hard in a way it hadn't before. Not sad anymore, just done being surprised. Phoebe sat down next to me, looked at the photo, and said, "You know what this means, right?" I said, "What?" She said, "It means they've already decided who they are to you, so now you get to decide who they are to you. And Evelyn, you don't owe them the daughter they threw out. You only owe yourself the woman you're about to become." I didn't know how much that sentence would matter, because 3 days later, I got a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, and when I played it back, it wasn't my mother's voice at all. It was my father's, and he wasn't calling to apologize. I played my father's voicemail 4 times before I could even process what I was hearing. His voice was flat, businesslike, the same tone he used when he was reading announcements off the bulletin at church. He said, "Evelyn, this is your father. I need you to call Mr. Kessler at the law office on Duke Street by Friday. There's a document regarding the Route 30 property that needs your signature. Do not discuss this with anyone." That was it. No "how are you," no mention of the baby, just a name, an address, and an order. I called Phoebe into the room and played it for her. She frowned halfway through and said, "The Route 30 property. Isn't that the rental house your grandfather left? The one that's supposed to split 3 ways between you and your 2 older brothers once you turn 23? Which I just had. I'd never chased it. I didn't need to be handed anything. I just wanted my family to want me around. But apparently, now that I was an inconvenience, my father wanted my signature on something fast. I drove out to a new apartment complex in Reading that week, a studio I'd found through a listing at the hospital where Phoebe worked. Cheap, small, water-stained ceiling in the corner, but mine. First month's rent covered by cashing out the small 401k I'd started at my old job stocking shelves at a hardware store. It wasn't much. It was mine. I sat at my new kitchen table, a card table Phoebe had donated from her own storage closet, and I called the lawyer. Mr. Kessler was polite in the careful way of someone paid to be polite. He explained that my father was asking me to sign away my third of the inherited property in the interest of family harmony, in exchange for what he called a modest one-time gift, $4,000. $4,000 for my third of a property worth, according to the county assessment site I looked up that same night, around $90,000. I asked Mr. Kessler why now, why this specific week. He hesitated, and then he said something he probably shouldn't have. He said, "Your father mentioned he'd like to settle the estate matters before further complications arise in the family." Further complications. That was me. That was my daughter growing inside me being called a complication by a lawyer relaying my own father's words. I didn't sign anything. I told Mr. Kessler I needed time to think, hung up, and sat at that card table with my hands flat on the surface, breathing. Phoebe came home from her shift to find me still sitting there in the dark, hadn't even turned the lights on. She said, "What happened?" I told her everything. She sat down across from me and said, "So let me get this straight. They threw you out for being pregnant, told the whole church you moved to Ohio, and now they want you to sign away $30,000 of what's rightfully yours for $4,000 before the baby's even born so it doesn't complicate anything?" I said, "That's about the size of it." She said, "Evelyn, that's not family protecting their name, that's family protecting their money." I didn't sign. Not that week. I started working extra shifts at a diner off Route 222, waiting tables at 7 months pregnant, feet swollen by 9 p.m., but tips and cash meant groceries that week. I went to my prenatal appointments alone, sat in waiting rooms filling out paperwork with a blank space where my emergency contact should be, because the first name that used to go there didn't want to be found anymore. Some nights I'd lie on my new secondhand mattress and think about the sewing room, about the needlepoint in the hallway, about how easy it had been for them to replace me with a story about a sick aunt in Ohio. But some nights I also thought about the card table and the extra shifts and the fact that for the first time in 23 years, nobody was deciding who I was allowed to be. 6 weeks before my due date, I finally called Mr. Kessler back. I told him to tell my father I wasn't signing anything, not for $4,000, not for any number. I told him I'd be keeping what was mine. There was a long pause on the line. Then Mr. Kessler said, quieter this time, almost like a warning meant kindly, "Evelyn, I should mention your father wasn't the only one who called this office this week." I asked who else. He said, "Your mother called yesterday. She didn't ask about the property at all." I didn't sleep that night. I kept turning Mr. Kessler's words over. "Your mother called yesterday. She didn't ask about the property at all." Trying to guess what would make my mother call a lawyer's office and not once mention the $90,000 house her husband was so eager to carve me out of. I called him back first thing the next morning, sitting in my car in the diner parking lot before my shift, engine running for the heat. Mr. Kessler was careful with his words, the way lawyers are when they're technically not supposed to be telling you something but feel like a person underneath the job. He said my mother had called asking whether there was any legal way to be listed as the baby's guardian of record instead of me, in the event I was, his words relaying hers, unable to provide a stable environment. I sat there gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. She wasn't trying to protect me. She wasn't even asking about the property anymore. She was quietly trying to build a case that I wasn't fit to raise my own daughter before my daughter was even born. I said, "Did you tell her anything?" He said, "I told her that's not something I could advise on and that she'd need her own attorney if she wanted to pursue that seriously. Evelyn, I want to be clear. This is not something I'm involved in, but I felt you should know." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in that parking lot for 10 minutes before I could walk inside and put an apron on. That afternoon, I told Phoebe everything on her lunch break, meeting her outside the hospital in Reading where she worked, both of us on a bench near the entrance because that was the only 10 minutes we could line up that week. She went quiet in a way I hadn't seen her before. Phoebe was never quiet. She finally said, "Your mother is trying to take your daughter from you before your daughter even has a name." I said, "I know." She said, "Evelyn, you need to document everything, every call, every voicemail, every text, starting now." I did. I saved Mr. Kessler's voicemail. I started keeping a notebook, dates, times, what was said. It felt paranoid and exhausting on top of everything else, but Phoebe was right, and some instinct in me already knew I might need it. 3 weeks later, I ran into my mother by accident for the first time since the kitchen. It was at a baby supply store off Lancaster Avenue, of all places. I was standing in the car seat aisle, 36 weeks pregnant, comparing prices on a display model, and I heard her voice 2 aisles over, talking to a store employee about gift options for a friend's baby shower. I froze. She hadn't seen me yet. For a second, I thought about just leaving my cart and walking out. Instead, I stood there and I watched her. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired around the eyes in a way she used to hide better. She picked up a soft yellow blanket, held it for a moment, longer than someone shopping for a friend would hold anything, and then put it back down like it burned her hands. She turned the corner and saw me. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she said, "Evelyn," just my name. Nothing else, the way she'd said Phoebe's name in a hospital doorway in another version of this story that hadn't happened yet. This was her own quiet version of that same shock. I said, "Were you shopping for me?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I heard you were still in Reading. I heard you were doing okay." I said, "No thanks to you or Dad." Her eyes filled up. And for 1 second, 1 single second, I thought she might finally say something real. Instead, she said, "Your father doesn't know I've been asking around about you." I said, "Does he know you called a lawyer to try to take my daughter?" Her face went white in the middle of that store, surrounded by strollers and diaper displays and cheerful cartoon animals on the wallpaper border. She said, No, I was only trying to understand our options in case you needed help." I said, "I don't need you deciding I'm unfit before you've even asked how I'm doing." She opened her mouth, and for the first time in my entire life, my mother didn't have anything scripted to say back. I turned my cart around and walked to another aisle, my heart pounding so hard I thought the whole store could hear it. I didn't look back to see if she left or if she stood there or if she cried in the parking lot the way I did the day I drove away from that kitchen. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't find out for another 5 months, was that my mother went home from that baby store and didn't tell my father she'd seen me at all. And that silence, that one secret she started keeping from him, was about to change everything neither of them saw coming. My daughter was 4 months the day my father showed up at my apartment in Reading. I want to be clear about something first. I never called him. I never told him where I lived. I found out later my mother gave him the address, the same address she'd been keeping secret from him for 5 months, ever since that baby store. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had my daughter, Grace, propped on my hip, mid-diaper change chaos, when the buzzer rang. I almost didn't answer it. Something made me look through the peephole first. My father was standing in the hallway of my building, alone, no suit, no deacon posture, just a windbreaker and a paper grocery bag in his hands like he didn't know what else to bring. I opened the door, but I didn't step back to let him in. I stood in the doorway with Grace on my hip, and I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Your mother told me where you were. She's been keeping it from me for months." He said it like a confession, like it cost him something to admit his own wife had been quietly checking on the daughter he'd thrown away. I said, "Good for her. What do you want?" He looked at Grace for a long moment. She had a fistful of my shirt in one hand and was studying him the way babies study everything new, with total, unbothered focus. He said, "I want to see her." I said, "You don't get to just show up and want things, Dad. You made a choice in that kitchen. You told me I wasn't your daughter anymore. Remember that part?" His jaw tightened. He said, "I remember." I said, "Do you know what the last 5 months have been like? I worked doubles at 7 months pregnant. I gave birth with Phoebe holding my hand because you weren't there. I've been listing none in the emergency contact box at every doctor's appointment because the people who were supposed to be there decided I was a disgrace instead." He didn't argue. That surprised me more than anything he could have said. My father always argued. He stood there in that hallway and just absorbed it, and something in his face cracked open in a way I'd genuinely never seen before. He said, "Your mother has a photo of her, of Grace. She's had it for months. She won't tell me where she got it, but I know now. She's been driving past your building, sitting outside sometimes, never coming up." I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't known that. He said, "I told myself I was protecting this family's name. I've spent 5 months telling that story to myself so I could sleep at night, but I look at you standing here and I look at her," he nodded toward Grace, "and I don't think I protected anything. I think I just lost my daughter and my granddaughter over what people at a church might whisper for a month before they forgot about it." I didn't say anything. I let him sit in that silence because for once in my life I wasn't the one who needed to fill it. He said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I know I don't get to ask for that. I'm asking if there's any room ever for me to earn something back, slowly, however long it takes." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the needlepoint in the hallway of my childhood home. I thought about the 4 garbage bags in my Civic. I thought about handled. I thought about a lawyer's office and a $4,000 check for $30,000 of what was mine. I thought about my mother, sitting outside this building in her car, never coming up, too ashamed and too afraid to knock. I said, "I'm not going to pretend the last 5 months didn't happen. I'm not going to hand you back what you threw away like it costs nothing." He nodded, eyes down. I said, "But you can start by not standing in my hallway with a bag of groceries like an apology. Sit down, meet your granddaughter, show up again next week, then the week after that. That's the only currency that means anything to me now." He looked up at me, and for the first time since I was a little girl, I watched my father's eyes fill with tears he didn't bother hiding. He said, "Okay." I stepped back and let him into my apartment, not because I owed him that, but because I decided, on my own terms, in my own doorway, that I was allowed to give what I chose to give when I chose to give it. He sat on my second-hand couch, stiff and unsure, and I put Grace in his arms. He held her the way people hold something they're terrified of dropping. She grabbed his finger the way babies do, that automatic grip that doesn't mean anything and somehow means everything. He said, quietly, "She's got your mother's eyes." I said, "She's got mine too, and nobody gets to tell either of us we're a disgrace ever again." He didn't argue with that either. My mother came the following Tuesday. She stood in that same doorway, smaller than I remembered, and she didn't ask to come in. She just said, "I've been outside this building 11 times. I never had the courage to knock until now." I let her in too, slowly, on my terms, the way I decide everything now. This wasn't the family I was raised to believe I had. That family disappeared the day I got a plate taken out of my hand and a deadline to be gone by Sunday. What I have now is something smaller, harder earned, and mine.
a daughter who will never know what it feels like to be somebody's shame, and two people who are learning, slowly, one Saturday at a time, what it costs to lose someone and what it takes to be let back in. I didn't burn it all down, I didn't need to. I just stopped being anyone's disgrace, and I let them watch me build a life good enough that showing up for it became the only thing they wanted.